Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads for our first live stream post The Acolyte, our first live stream in about 7 weeks, where we're going to talk about the news and everything going on in the world of Star Wars and allow you guys to ask us anything you want that's not Acolyte related. You can send in your questions. A lot of you already have started sending in your questions, your comments to the chat. So send them into the chat. Ask us anything you want. This type of stream, we do have topics. We're going to run down those topics. We're going to try to get to most of those big topics, big news stories from the last week or so, especially, but maybe last month or so since we last did one of these. And then as we're going through each topic, we'll take your guys' questions, your comments, all of the stuff you want to talk about in the chat. This is an ask us anything type of deal. So if you have any questions, your comments will kind of drive the show and the length of the show and however long it goes. And we're looking forward to interacting more directly with you guys without the Acolyte reviews here in front. And this is how our live streams are going to go, where this is weekly. We do this every single week. So when there's more news related stuff, we might go live on different days. As of now, this Tuesday time, 7 p.m. Pacific-ish, has worked well for us, seems to work well for all of you. And so we're planning on keeping that going outside of, a breaking news story, which we will try to cover that day when it does drop. So keep an eye out for that as we shift our schedules around. But let us know in the chat as well, for those of you who do enjoy these shows and do enjoy our lives, what's the best day for all of you? What's the best times for all of you? We try to be as flexible as possible, with our personal lives around your guys' schedules, because this is a show driven to talk to all of you. So make sure you send us in the chat all of those details. And then without further ado, let's just get into the topics here. And Sanak, you're going to start us off. What's our first topic here today?
Well, if there is any big news for sure, that is this week's announcement leading up to San Diego Comic-Con of the first of 3 parts of a maxi series, which is kind of just a longer mini series, but it is the Battle of Jakku Insurgency Rising. It'll be a 4-issue start to this maxi series, and it's nice to just be getting back to early canon. That's one thing that, if you remember the hype, everything from like the Journey to the Force Awakens and everything, you're like, I saw a bunch of different things happening in Battlefront, in the games and comics leading up to like what was like the founding parts of the Force Awakens. But the Battle of Jakku is one that was very much video game focused for a long time. And what's really interesting is that they're taking this 1 year between Battle of Endor and Battle of Jakku that's already filled with so many different books and comics, but they're revitalizing Star Wars Uprising, which, if you don't know what that is a mobile game that is now defunct. This was back when Disney was just throwing everything Star Wars out there, but it had a pretty interesting story, and it was like described as like, okay, this is a crucial part of the canon leading up to Battle of Jakku, what you're reading in the Aftermath trilogy. And it basically focused on the Anowit sector, which is where Bespin and Cloud City from episode 5 are. And the way it goes down after the death of Palpatine is that sector goes into a hard lockdown with an iron blockade under Moff Adelhard, and then he's got these purge troopers of sorts, not like the purge troopers that we know from the Inquisitorius, but they're these big hulky guys who enforce his iron will, make sure no communication goes in and out. And the story is basically you with a bunch of smugglers, informants, assassins, bounty hunters, kind of leading an internal revolution as you like build up your skills, create these alliances. And it had a ton of concept art, which was so well done. It still is one of my favorite things from early canon, just the idea of what exactly the galaxy was looking like in the days after Battle of Endor. But the game ended pretty quickly. It wasn't very popular. It had an ambitious story to it, but the gameplay was pretty frustrating. It's very platformy. Mobile games of like a decade ago now are not what we like considered today. Like that's when they were just starting to get going, and even in 2015, I always kind of felt it was behind the times there. So for this to not simply be ignored, but like revitalized, now you're going to bring back Luke, Han, and Leia to be big parts of the story, where Lando has a role to play because we get a little blurb of that in Aftermath Empire's End. That's gotten me super excited this whole week because I can't wait to see not just early canon like be reintroduced, brought to the forefront here with this 10-year anniversary of The Force Awakens coming out, but also just it's awesome to see that it's not being forgotten and overwritten like some more recent cases. And it only seems like it's going to become crucial and revitalized again. You're going to see that concept art really come to life again. We're going to get stuff from Shadow the Sith kind of be connected here and stuff that we saw in Aftermath. So really, it's the most exciting news that I've got to share for this week. I couldn't be more excited. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Liam?
I feel very similarly. I think this is a period in Star Wars that I was starting to get very concerned is an afterthought at this point. Really, when we were leading up to The Force Awakens, we remember we got our journey to The Force Awakens, and it's kickstarted with Aftermath, the first book in that trilogy, and then Lost Stars, which had the final act in on the Battle of Jakku, but didn't really connect that much to this story overall. And then we had stuff like Uprising, and we had the Shattered Empire comics. There were a lot of things that were building up this 1 year period. And since then, it's basically been ignored outside of Battlefront 2 and the tie ins to Battlefront 2. So I like that we're starting to go back to this because it is an important period. And I think now, especially when we have Imperial Remnant, we have Mandalorian, obviously, 5 years after these events, the Empire is still living on in various forms, right? So, what's the difference between the death of the Empire here at the Battle of Jakku and the Imperial remnants that we eventually see? Is it just the death of the organized empire? Now we have the warlords and the Moffs all leading different factions, but there's still a shadow council leading this whole thing behind the scenes. What's Thrawn's relation? What's Pelion's? There's so many added elements here now that weren't here in 2014, 15, 16, 17 when we were really exploring this story. That I think at this point, the comics have kind of been one of the unifiers of canon. They've been one of the things that try to keep as much of it straight as possible. And it seems like here is a good place for us to at least try to bridge a bunch of elements across books and comic books and video games and the films and now what they're doing in television and see how close can we really get this thing to being back to kind of the story that it was originally conceived as, especially in the era of Star Wars streaming. So I think this is a pretty cool thing. I think a maxi series is a good idea. I think it's not a period. We do have so much story here that it's not a period I want to overly focus on. I don't want to write stories in here for the next 5 years. Like I don't think this needs to be a massive initiative, but I do like that it's giving being given effort, and I do like that it's trying to connect everything. Hopefully, with the writers on board and the seminal storytellers here amongst the Star Wars create comic creators we have now. Hopefully, here is a good place, a good wrap up, a good tie in into eventually what we get as technically kind of the first 5 years of that New Republic era. Maybe the next comic series goes into there and starts to bridge that beginning of the New Republic era with ultimately what's happening here in the Mandalorian and with Thrawn. So this is pretty exciting to me.
Yeah, and I think it really helps that it's going to be 12 issues released bi-weekly until the end of the year. I mean, comics have been pretty overfilled in a way, even if you do like the Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi period. There have been crossovers that have almost taken away from a lot of the mainline stories. Some of the mainline stories have stagnated when they've had that. Sometimes they've stagnated without those crossovers. And it is just 1 year in canon, right? Like roughly 1 year. So yeah, we had Shadows of the Empire. We had some books here and there back in EU, but canon has like filled it up, and we got Outlaws coming soon. So there's only really so much that this current time period of comics can really do. It's almost feeling like Clone Wars, the show with those 3 years of warfare, like all the episodes that we got out of it. So yeah, I'm excited for us to just like end this year on like a very definitive note with comics. I assume we're gonna once we finish just kind of bridge the gap leading up to Mandoverse, starting more somewhere like early to mid 2025. But yeah, this does feel like comics once again are at least being allowed the grace of having one solid chunk of the story of Star Wars and to have an impact. I mean, to revitalize a video game that was a mobile game was already shocking enough to me, but to now bring in characters like heavy hitters like Luke, who is really MIA other than like some Battlefront 2 campaign stuff here. It's exciting to me. I'm very, very curious where it's gonna go. And Yeah, I really hope that we get to see some really interesting storytelling that sets up First Order stuff with Ray Sloan departing at the end of Aftermath, but also getting us, into the driver's seats of the Mandoverse and having great connections between the shows, and maybe also being a new way of sourcing things for the show, just like we saw Black Chrysanthemum back from Star Wars 2015 finally showed up in Book of Boba Fett. I'd love for whatever's the next era of comics after this maxi series to maybe be another sourcing ground.
Hmm. Definitely. And I'm glad that Comic Con stuck to the comics too for Star Wars. A lot of it, it's nice to see a return of the resurgence of Comic Con being a comic platform, and Star Wars seems as committed as ever in comics, and that's awesome to see. Especially in a world where attention spans are shortening, and comics seem to be something that is in a bit of a downswing right now with the falling positivity and excitement around like the MCU and stuff. I'm hoping that Star Wars seems to be maintaining a strong audience. It seems to be maintaining an audience that's willing and devoted to read these stories, and I'm glad they're still continuing with this and all their plans. I'm very excited about what they have coming here for us next.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, let's move on to our next topic. And this one's going to be a pretty short piece of news compared to the comics. We know that the Mandalorian Grogu is supposed to come out in 2026. We got a ways to go still, but Pedro Pascal, the Mandalorian himself, is a very busy man these days. He's got Fantastic Four. He had Last of Us Part Two. He's coming out in some rom com. He's in
Gladiator
Gladiator
2.
2. He's been busy. He's blown up, and frankly, for the last 2 seasons, he's been almost reluctant to be on set. Like, he was very much so for season 2 of Mando, but not at all for season 3, and I'm pretty sure for Book of Boba Fett too. So he's been kind of almost treating it as like a voice actor role for a while, and that's, more power to him. That was kind of how he signed on anyways, but I don't think he expected to be this big. So now it's like, well, you're doing a movie. Are we gonna see him unmasked? Mandalorian season 3 kind of downplays the children to watch his cultish behavior and kind of makes it so that you can choose to be like the Mandalorians of the Clone Wars and keep your helmet on or off whenever, or you can continue with the old ways, the watch's ways. But regardless, I think people want to see Pedro's face. So recently there was some news that, like, filming hadn't started yet, except for some time sensitive shooting. And, we can only speculate what that really means, but I would say it's gonna be Pedro, unmasked with Grogu or unmasked and detained by some Imperial or something. It's gotta be like a pivotal couple of scenes where he needs to be unmasked. I personally would love for it to actually really recontextualize a lot of season 3, a lot of his behavior. Like, I understand he's trying to fit in, he's trying to not like get rid of one of the last few vestiges of his life that fully trusts him. I understand that, but it does undo a lot of season two's very strong end and emotional end that Book of Boba Fett felt like it was honoring, but then Mando season 3 didn't really evolve it in a meaningful way outside of with Bo Katan. And I mean, if you're gonna have Bo Katan walk both worlds, shouldn't you have the guy who did it for his literal son? Kind of double down on that again. That's what I would think. But I don't know, Liam. What are you thinking those shoots could be for?
It could be for that, and I think that's a very strong possibility, especially with so many projects that this guy's got going. And it would make sense, I guess, in the grand scheme of things for Star Wars to try to maybe keep some of this initial shooting more secretive. Star Wars film has always been, or at least in the Disney era, very much so tight-lipped. And it's so if they are not really saying what they're working on, it might be some of the bigger surprises, bigger reveals of the show. Maybe it's a smaller set, a closed set. This is a type of thing that is exciting in a lot of ways because it allows us to speculate about a movie that seems kind of straightforward, right? Like The Mandalorian Grogu, I think one of the things that's been a little underwhelming to me about that being a movie. I'm excited to see the spectacle of what a Mandalorian show, could be on the big screen, as we've seen glimpses of, especially in season 2. But it's not necessarily something that I feel like is going to push the storytelling boundaries of Star Wars. But if there are some surprises in store akin to the end of The Mandalorian season 2, that would be pretty cool if this was a smaller set, uh, more secretive shoot where they're not really wanting to say what they're working on. And they really could be a variety of different things. But I do think Pedro he needs to take his helmet off in the film. We do need to get back to that. I completely agree with you where his lesson feels kind of undone by what he learns in the last two episodes of The Mandalorian season 2. A great arc for that character from where he goes at the end of season 1 all the way to where he goes in season 2, slowly learning to trust people, slowly learning what it means to be outside of his little group. And so with the Mandalorians now a bit more unified under Bo-Katan, you have the two different religions, two different factions of the Mandalorians now unified, those who take off their helmet, those who don't. I think Din Djarin needs to be kind of a bridge between those two factions. He needs to take off his helmet. We need to see him. We need to see that interaction, those character moments. I think at the very least, this film needs to go for something a bit more for its leads because Bo Katan really did take over Mandalorian season 3, especially for the emotional arcs. I think her story was the driving force of that season. And then Din and Grogu were there to set the plot forward. It didn't really feel like their season at times. Grogu's honestly even more than Din's. Din didn't feel like that much of a character in season 3. So I do feel like giving him more work, giving Pedro more work to play the role that's kind of put him in this position, right? The Mandalorian has set him up for this. He's done so many great side roles or minor characters in the past, but it was the Mandalorian that really kick-started this version of the Pedro Pascal that we all know from as a leading man, right? So I would like to see that special care be brought back to this role, the role that made him famous, and the role that really for a long time was the thing that had people interested and excited about Star Wars again. And I hope the Mandalorian Grogu is that thing. I hope it's the thing that reignites a new passion for not just Star Wars, but Star Wars film, Star Wars theatrical release, and just gets us all going and excited for what is coming next.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like you said, I think what we got with Bo-Katan's faction was strong connections to the Clone Wars, to Rebels. But it's interesting, right? Like what the Watch's philosophy, the old ways as they claim it does feel like a good way to flesh out and almost like return to a more noble like path for Bo-Katan's life. I mean, she starts off as a terrorist. That's a simple fact in the Clone Wars. It's not a very noble group. She's a splinter of a faction called Death Watch. It's not a great sign already. So for her to have turned out into this like very strong character, I do appreciate that. But now you have to bring it back to the original Mandalorian, the one who was bringing everyone on with this show. And yeah, I agree. Grogu needs to become more of a character. Din needs to actually have direction. This is a great way to do it. I love if it's stuff with maybe Sigourney Weaver. We've heard that she's going to be casted with this, or some surprises. Maybe they're hiding a Luke recast, or maybe Iman Esfandi is playing Ezra. I don't know. Like it's got to be something notable. And the helmet would be a very simple but notable thing to do. But if it is, other characters definitely would be excited. But yeah, no, that's what we got for Mandalorian Grogu, and we'll finish off this new segment and get to your guys' questions next. But our last topic is on Star Wars Outlaws that is going to come out next month. It's gone gold, but they've been releasing Ubisoft and Massive a lot of videos about the characters, gameplay, and all that. And just a couple of days ago, they released footage, a 10-minute footage of a mission that you could be carrying out on Tatooine. It's not really anything to like go crazy about and all that. But my impressions of it were that it is looking a little unpolished. It does remind me like a lot of Ubisoft games for sure, but it's not like like some people are claiming where it's going to be horrible, this and that. I do honestly think it looks a little bit better than some like Assassin's Creed's games. Like Unity was a huge mess on its launch day. It doesn't look that bad, but there are some things that I noticed like in the actual mission and all that, where like some explosions, even some cutscene explosions, looked a little choppy. I don't know. I think anything Tatooine these days always irks people a little bit, so they'll notice some things a little bit more negatively. So yeah, I'm excited for the game. I'm gonna definitely play the game as close to start date as possible. Let us know if you guys want us to play some Let's Plays on here, and we'll probably do it a little differently than we have with our other video games. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are here, Liam. Does it look good to you? Is it overblown reaction? Do you think that maybe it's just some unpolished stuff that they put out for publicity purposes? What do you think the direction is here?
I think it is a little bit of all of that. I think one of the things that you would think a company like Ubisoft would know is they generally get criticism no matter what it is they put out, even if it's not Star Wars, right? So you would expect their stuff to be kind of perfect. And when they show you things that have flaws, it is a disappointment. It always is, especially when it's related to Star Wars, their first time with an IP, the first time we've seen Star Wars under new direction from another studio since EA, so seeing this now, seeing the flaws that are there, I can't really say it's surprising. This is kind of more reminiscent of what we originally saw with this game. I think the story trailer, that presentation that we did a reaction to back in, what was it, April or so, May, that won a lot of people back over. And it definitely got me a little bit more excited for the direction the game's story goes. But I was still concerned about the gameplay. I'm still concerned about the microtransactions, the season pass. I mean, and all of those sorts of things. And I think those are still concerns now. Really, we're only going to have to wait and see what the game is like when we get our hands on it before we can really make an accurate assessment. But I still feel the same way that felt last year when originally did a reaction for this from the Xbox showcase when they announced it, which is I think this is going to be like a 6 or 7 out of 10 game. Not anything bad in the world of video games. That might be considered bad. A lot of video game, people consider a game that's not at least an 8 out of 10 a bad game, which is kind of strange that they're graded on such a different curve than film or television. Or like if I see somebody give a 7 out of 10 to a movie, I'm like, I'm going to go see that. That's actually a good score. You get a 7 out of 10 to a game, most people don't even want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But like, I think this is going to be a 7 out of 10 game. I think it's going to be a fun little adventure game, open world game. If you're new to adventure and open world games and you never really play them and you only play Star Wars stuff, you might love this game. But if you're somebody who plays a lot of open world games like I do, this is probably going to be something that you're like, cool ideas, could use way more polish. But ultimately, I think it will be fun, at least for that first, 10 to 20 hours that you're trying to get the story done. I'm more worried about how open world games usually, a great one will suck you in to the point where you're playing for 30 to 50 hours and completing all the stuff post game. I don't necessarily buy that from Outlaws so far, but I think it's going to be an enjoyable ride and something that we'll be saying like, hey, not perfect, but hopefully for a sequel they can get it a lot better.
Yeah, I'm keeping my hopes up still a little bit just because I've liked a lot of the other presentation videos that are very lore heavy. They do have a lot of care in creating these factions and all that. I also saw a couple of days ago that some Chinese toy manufacturers had come out with some character figures, and it looked like maybe we're gonna see Black Sun be as like the
Good.
DLC main leads, which I think would be a really great way money wise for Ubisoft to really draw in people for sure. But yeah, I'd appreciate if we got to see Prince Sizor again and Black Sun really revitalized in their original era for sure. Even if the game isn't great, I think I'm gonna still appreciate the connections that it's doing to the comics. They've been very, very clear that War of the Bounty Hunters, Kira's appearance in the game, like those are intentional. Those have been well thought out. And as much as I like Survivor and Fallen Order, they're its own sandbox. I really wish that Survivor could have almost pushed a little bit more connections to Kenobi or something like with Riva as an Inquisitor, but I can understand the era that it's in that it maybe felt like, we don't need to connect to everything here. But in this era, when you're gonna have a huge emphasis on the underworld in this game, I'm expecting to see good connections, and I think we're gonna see that. So, yeah, I'm excited. I'm cautious, but maybe I might get that Ubisoft Plus pass and just get the game like
Yeah.
that, and then play it for 2 months straight and be like, I had a good run with it.
Yeah. Seems to be the way that a lot of people are getting around having to buy Ubisoft games nowadays. Man, yeah, I'm probably, knowing me, definitely going to end up buying the game. It's just a matter of hopefully it has enough content to want to continue because I play a lot of mediocre open world games. I enjoy the old open world loop, and I think I'm going to enjoy it because it's Star Wars open world. hopefully there's enough meat there to really get past the the flaws. Because we're all willing, as much as we all complain about bugs in games, we're all willing to push past it. There's very few games that are broken enough to never touch them again. And even some that are broken enough to never touch them again, they get bombed when they come out, but then eventually they find their footing and find their audience. You could say Cyberpunk is one that now is getting glowing reviews after that disastrous first year. And I played through that the first year when it came out. So I enjoy the loop. I think I'm going to like this. It's just a matter of they've set the bar kind of high now with Survivor and Fallen Order. And now that Survivor's had some open world elements, I feel like this game, that's the big test for it, is it has to at least be bigger, more expansive, and more enjoyable than the open world elements of Survivor, because Survivor is not an open world game. It's just got one planet with open world elements, really.
Yeah.
So if this somehow feels smaller than that, I think that's ultimately a failure. It has to at least feel bigger than that. And I know a lot of people have been kind of disappointed with the size of Tatooine too. And I don't blame them, because I think it's going to be difficult to capture the scope of planets, right? When you go to different lands or countries in different games, RPGs, you can make them whatever size you want, but it has to feel we're on planets, right? We have to feel that scope of what a planet feels like. Doesn't mean we have to cover the entire planet, but we need to kind of feel the scope of what a planet should feel like. So hopefully there's enough content here. Hopefully this isn't just it for Tatooine. Hopefully is a bit more different cities, different areas to really explore, and ultimately maybe new cities, new places that we haven't been on the planet, different sides of the planet that we haven't seen. I think those are different things that they could do to really add some extra content, extra hours, and just make this feel like a completely different Star Wars experience.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. But yeah, let's move into the comments that we got here. Hope you guys enjoyed a little bit of our news coverage here for our ninth episode of Beggar Scanning Dispatch. When we have a lot of news that we just can accumulate into one stream, we'll kind of do it like this. If we only have like a little bit of small news, you'll just see a normal live Q&A, right? But we like to make a little bit of distinction here for a lot of people who've been joining us through our Acolyte watch through. So yeah, just want to give you guys our thoughts on some pretty exciting news. And let's get to the comments. First off, we have Anthony Tiff. Thank you for joining, as always. You start off with the question of who do you guys think is the most powerful Jedi in Legends and canon? For me, Luke in Legends and Anakin in canon. I think you're pretty spot on. I mean, it is a nature of a lot of legends being set right after original trilogy. Prequels are off limits, so everyone wanted to cash in on a lot of iconography. So you still had the Galactic Civil War going on for another 10 years, and it was incredible to start off with the Thrawn trilogy. That is still probably the best writing. Maybe Hand of Thrawn, duology tops into the Bantam era, but for a good chunk of the 90s. It was just Luke, Han, and Leia just doing whatever they wanted, right? And yeah, we had some compelling villains and all, but Luke was the only Jedi until his academy really got off the ground. And I wouldn't even say like anyone was close to him in competition. Maybe in terms of like how many people they've killed, like Kip Duron with the Star Crusher, but or sorry, the Sun Crusher. But yeah, no, Luke was kind of OP for such a long time that I felt like Hand of Thrawn was like, let's pull it back and bring him back to being a character instead of just like this uber powerful guy. But then you got canon, Anakin, Clone Wars, Chosen One. It all made sense to only make him as strong as possible in the Clone Wars, especially. But I think what we can appreciate about that is that just as much as he's growing powerful during the war, he's also like growing and stronger in his hatred. He's got Jedi hiding things as even close Jedi to him, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka leaves and all that. So yeah, I mean, he obviously had chances to show off his powers and EU comics and all that, but Clone Wars was like, let's make sure it's tied into the character. So yeah, I agree with you, Anthony. I think those are pretty much spot on.
Yeah, I agree too. They're the same. 90s, Luke did have the benefit from a power scaling perspective of in the 90s, there not being really as many set rules around Star Wars, no prequel trilogy, no sequels like we've gotten in canon. So really back then it was just whatever they could come up with that kind of fit a fantasy sci-fi build, right? Like there weren't that many rules, and the original trilogy is much more grounded in its storytelling. So and Luke got every power known to mankind.
Yeah.
Every power that superheroes ever had, Luke had it. He could close black holes. He could do anything. So he's ridiculously powerful. And then they build on that, obviously, because they tried to keep a consistent continuity. They build on that in NJO. They build on that in Legacy of the Force. They build on that in Fate of the Jedi. He's pretty much untouchable in Legends. So, yeah, absolutely Luke in Legends. And then canon being much more grounded. I think Anakin is the only one that comes close to really being a maybe even semi-Legends power level, and I think he's gonna get there more so in the Ahsoka show, because now if they're starting to shift him more towards a Mortis god direction, then Anakin's gonna be the one that's uber powerful. But in Legends, people forget in Legends, Anakin spends far more time as an apprentice than he does as a knight, and so a lot of his power levels, although unreal for the Jedi of the prequel era, they're not close to what they would have been had they been writing Jedi Master Anakin. I feel like so if we somehow got to that point, if he ever became a master, I think they would have probably gone on some extremes with Anakin's power level. But honestly, the Mortis stuff in Legends is one of the things that makes him even semi close to Luke. Other than that, he doesn't have nearly the feats. So I definitely would agree with that. And then as for your next question, is it okay for a non Jedi light side user to become a Force ghost, or does it contradict George Lucas's view on how the Force operates? I do think it's okay. I think what George Lucas is saying, especially through the Clone Wars with his lore, is that Qui-Gon is the one that discovers how to do it. It doesn't maybe part of the reason he figures out how to do it is because of his openness to different realities, different perceptions of the Force. And there's kind of a reason why somebody as powerful as like Mace Windu never appears as a Force ghost. It's something specific to the type of user and somebody open to that type of different view on the Force. And Yoda, for all his faults and stuff, he's always been somebody completely open to learning. And he's open to learning not just from the best of the Jedi, but from open to learning from new perspectives from children, as we see in Attack of the Clones or in like Yoda Dark Rendezvous. He's open to different ways of viewing the Force, even after 900 years, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons why he's able to ultimately achieve that, is because Yoda's always looking to learn. I think plenty of Jedi are closed off to it. So I do think it has to be a light side power. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the ghosts of Sith living on. I think it can make for interesting and exciting stories, but I think the ghosts of Sith, as we've seen in canon, I kind of like the idea of like Anakin's spirit being pulled in and out. I kind of like that idea for a Sith, that it's much harder to manifest in through dark power. The way Palpatine is having a difficult time, he needs a body to inhabit. He needs to possess something. I think there's a purity in the way a light sider is able to manifest in the Force versus the darkness of like a haunting, like a traditional ghost, a possession that a dark sider might need. I kind of like that distinction.
Yeah, no, I'm in full agreement. I think canon has done a much better distinction. I know we've got cool powers like transfer essence and all that, or yeah, there's a lot more alchemic and sorcery involved with Sith power. So what's it to say that they can't become ghosts, right? But I don't know. Even in EU, it wasn't like they were ghosts. It was more like they were like stuck to a place, stuck to an item, right? And I think it makes sense that, like, while these Jedi were able to, if they knew the training, if they knew the knowledge, become ghosts, or in the case of Anakin, just powerful enough to just get a Sparks Note version on the fly, to become a Force ghost. Sith, like, if they really wanna have an impact on this, like, immortal plane, they almost have to, like, give up, like, most of themselves and, like, only a fragment lives on. It's almost torturous. Like, we see Bane in the Clone Wars, and he's all fluff, right? I don't think, as fun as Mark Hamill's voice acting and everything is there, that's not really Bane. That's just, like, a specter, what is left, like, maybe 5 to 10%. We've seen Darth Moment from the Darth Vader comics. He's tied to a mask. Yes, it can take over possession, just like the X Panchard mask from Shadow of the Sith. Parts of them are living on there. We're not gonna say Force users are, like, completely ever gone in Star Wars, but to say, like, oh, like, the entirety of their essence, of their being, of their soul or spirit, however you wanna put it, being able to become Force ghosts, it wasn't a concept in EU, and I think canons really doubled down that whatever they do to, like, stay on this plane, it's pretty horrible. It's not who they are, it's not what they want to be. It really is just, like, transferring between bodies or taking over bodies in the Sith lineage is, like, at best what they can do, and there's no guarantee that they're, like, the dominant soul possession anyways. But I also don't think it's gotta be Jedi, like Liam was saying, right? It's not like Qui-Gon was like, "I found some dusty old book on Acto and I figured out all these details." It's like, no, he went to this, like, netherworld force. He was listening, for scraps of information, and then the force drew him to it. He is someone who's always saying, "Be mindful of the living force." He's not just like a Jedi who's like Mundi, who's like, "Let's think big picture and how we're gonna help the galaxy." He was listening to what the Force was compelling him to do, and that's what drew him to this knowledge, to the priestesses, to understanding how to become one, right? And it took him a long time still because his body perished before he could really finish his studies too. So the idea of, like, just Jedi of the light side doing this ritual, I don't know. I don't go with that, but I do think that the Jedi, if we are more like Qui-Gon or like Jedi to try to be like Qui-Gon when it comes to that period of training to be a Force ghost, are probably the best candidates to becoming Force Ghosts. It is hard to be a lightsider in general, but it's harder still to be a Jedi. It is a very specific way of resisting darkness, resisting your weaknesses and folly. So yeah, I mean, other Jedi could, like, I could see an Ahsoka do it, but still Jedi trained, so she still has those principles. I don't know if I would say like a Marin or anyone else, right, who we know are like kind of good characters, but use darker elements of Night Sister magic if they're really suited for that. I'm not opposed to it, but there definitely needs to be like more of like trials and tribulations to get to that position where you're at least as close to being as serene as Qui-Gon was when he was training and listening to the Force. It's got to be difficult still. I really just think that Anakin should be the only combo breaker when it comes to the Force and becoming a Force ghost. Everyone else, you gotta still learn like a specific way of doing it. You still have to be of the right mindset. It's difficult. To make it easy, I think kind of loses its appeal, and to make it almost Jedi exclusive, I don't want to say you have to be trapped to it, but there's a reason why it's always like Jedi versus Sith, light side versus dark, right? They are going to be the most attuned and most likely to be, convinced of learning this. And some Jedi may not even want to live on forever. This is another concept that I don't think we've really explored, but I'd love to see like Jedi be like, I know what to do to become a Force spirit. Maybe be like EU Obi-Wan Kenobi's like, I've done enough. I can't keep this form forever. You won't be able to see me live forever. Like I'd like to almost see Force spirits go away again, not just like be around forever. Because it's like the question's like, why aren't you just around to help at every single moment possible with characters that you know? But I'd also like Jedi who know the knowledge just be like, no, I think I'm happy just being one with the Force and not like trying to keep some sort of consciousness. But yeah, we'll see how Mortis is handled in Ahsoka before we really have any concrete explanations on that.
Well, keep sending in those questions and those comments, everybody. We're going to keep running here for a little less than an hour. So keep those comments rolling in. Keep those questions coming in. If you want to make sure you get one on the show, send in a super chat. Helps out the channel. Get your question bumped up to the top. So we greatly appreciate all that. And if you guys do enjoy this stream and this format, check out our Patreon. There are other perks there, including other live streams. Check out the Patreon, YouTube memberships. There are plenty of other things where you can get more Star Wars content out there for as little as $1 a month. So check it out if you are interested. And thank you again for watching this stream. All right, to Anthony's next question, who says, I find an example from Legends in the Old Republic MMORPG where Darth Mar, Sith who teamed up with the Jedi to defeat Vitiate became Force Ghost after embracing the light side of the Force. He also told Satil Shan as a Force ghost that he was no Jedi, but considered himself a light side user. So I think, I don't know if we'll go fully into that one because that's kind of piggybacking on a lot of what we just talked about, Anthony, but it's the same thing to me where a Force ghost needs to be a light side user, needs to be somebody who gives themselves back to the light. And I think let's carry that into your next comment here, where you say one more thing. I kind of disagree with Liam's idea that there are no great Jedi. That's not my idea. I was repeating George Lucas's idea. Because Revan or Kreia and the EU seem to use both sides at the same time, especially Revan. And I understand what you're saying, but what I would say to that to counter is they don't often use both sides at the same time. They flip back and forth between the light and the dark side. Revan uses the light, was a hero of the Jedi, and ultimately falls to the dark because he gives in to his darker tendencies, to his darker power. Same with Kreia, falls to the dark, becomes Darth Treya, and when you kill her at the end of KOTOR 2, she's a Sith Lord. So Revan has a fall and a redemption arc similar to Vader, similar to Ulic Qel-Droma, similar to so many Jedi and Sith we've seen in the past. Kreia doesn't necessarily have a redemption, but she has a fall. So you could say there are Jedi that use both the light and the dark, and there are plenty, but you don't often see them use it at the same time. You don't see them try to be a master of both. And when they do, most of the time that leads to their fall to the dark side. And so that's what I personally feel is that you can try. And in Revan's case, like I said before originally, I don't think the idea of gray Jedi existing really should be a thing, but I do think that if there were to be gray Jedi, it should be people who are exceptional and special. And Revan is certainly that exceptional one at the time, right? If you were to tell me that when we made a KOTOR movie or show or new video game, and you wanted to officially term Revan as a gray Jedi in Star Wars canon, I don't necessarily have a problem with that because Revan is somebody who is kind of a once in a generation Jedi. He's a ultimate force user, right? He, outside of being a chosen one like Anakin, he's one of the next levels of kind of gifted and destined Jedi to shape the fabric of the galaxy. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I just personally think that every time you see a Jedi try to use both, they ultimately fall and then have to be redeemed again. So that would be my counter.
Yeah, it's a difficult answer to really give, Anthony. I mean, I think the way canon has really delineated it, it is a bit more cancerous that the dark side, once you tap into it, it's not like you can be like, okay, I just had to use it for this one purpose, and okay, now the mission is done, and I can just go back to how things were. Once you get a taste of it, it doesn't go away. Right? And I think that's what Lucas had always intended, and that's what canon has really emphasized. The EU definitely does have people's interpretations of that fluctuate, right? Especially in like an MMO, right? With a character like Darth Mar, who's so ingrained in the dark side, is part of the leadership council, and then becomes the de facto leader of the Sith Empire, to then like have a change of heart at the very end, and then become, this Force ghost. It's like, sure, fine, that's whatever. But I think you have to also consider the logistics of that character change and arc. By the time Valkyrian is even a thing, canon has already taken over, right? This is an MMO that is continuing and is the only real Legends content that we still have coming out. But it's the nature of a game that was popular, making money. Why would you stop it, right? It's just a license that they had to maintain for a long time. So they're like, okay, let's just go wild now. Now there aren't restrictions. Now there aren't people telling us exactly what to do or what are limiting us. It is in of itself like its own mini EU, while we have canon increasingly becoming bigger and bigger, bigger. So would that have been a choice? I think that these developers and writers of Bioware would have really focused in on with Lucasfilm's like oversight, before canon really officially took over. No, I don't think so. I think they would have probably been like, let's pull it back. If you're gonna do this, you got to make this like an entire update like this. If that was the big story arc, right, that just led to his death, let's spend a lot of time with him like dealing with the Force and some mystical stuff, or spend a lot of time leading up to his death before he becomes a Sith. Right? It is a very, very fast thing in the game. So I would say the logistics of that is why they kind of have fun with it. But then there's also the question of like, are you saying Gray Jedi as like an ideology? And
Right, right.
yeah, I don't know. First of all, I don't think if there is anything between a Sith and a Jedi that they'd be calling themselves Gray Jedi. I think that's just a very poorly thought out name. It would be something entirely else. Like even Imperial Knights, it still has a little bit more dark side connotations, even if it is like the Fell Empire and they use white lightsabers and all that. But if there is a faction that is in between the philosophy of the Jedi and Sith, I don't think they'd include Jedi in their name. They'd want to be as separate as possible. So I don't think that ideology would work. And we've seen it in New Jedi Order. That is a big thing, especially in the latter half when they kind of go more to this grayish perspective of the Force that's really pushed by what Jason Solo learns, from Under Verger, through his trials and tribulations with Embrace of Pain, through his trials and discoveries of like just mapping out the galaxy after the Yuuzhan on Var, right? Like electric judgment becomes a thing that Luke is just doing because he can balance his darkness and lightness now, and like this is what all the Jedi are like. But in those same books within another series, by Legacy of the Force, they're like, look, he felt the dark side. This is not working for us. We have to go to a little bit more of a stricter black and white. So there is even like the idea that this ideology has been played around with and like justification for how to balance out these things. And even EU authors eventually like it's not working for us. It's just an easy escape to give you powers to let you do things, but it hurts your characters. And Legacy of the Force is frankly considered one of the weaker series of later EU, especially. It has a lot of strong groundwork, but a lot of it is built off a New Jedi Order and a lot of Bantam era, especially. So yeah, I don't know. I get where you're coming from with the Gray Jedi stuff. I'm just saying that it's been played around with and it's been very uneven. And even when books have taken a real long time to look at the ideology of it, characters come to that realization of like it's not good for us. It's not who we're meant to be. So I'm happy that canon has shied away from it, but I am open to what Liam is saying. Have these characters that are once in a generation powers that they can't be defined by an ideology, that they don't have to be controlled or affected by these powers of light and dark. Sure, but it should not be like a thing that a group just embraces unless
Yeah.
they have like a very important thing to do and say about Star Wars moving to the future, and should be like decade spanning effects. It shouldn't just be like a thing that people pick up and they're like, yeah, after 2 years, you're like, that wasn't really great.
No, definitely. And I definitely want to clarify that from my perspective too. I'm talking about no, there shouldn't be an ideology for Gray Jedi. I just don't think that that can really exist, not for Force wielders per se. Maybe you could have some type of cult or
Yeah.
group, a religious group that's not necessarily in tune with the Force who wants to balance both. I think that could be an interesting take. You could have a lot of different perspectives with the light and dark and mix it. And I do think as you go further in the past, right, when you do Dawn of the Jedi, maybe new or early Old Republic era or whatever the early bridge is between Dawn of the Jedi and the Old Republic, especially when we get to canon, you can play around with power a bit more because I think when you go back to those eras, there's less rules, there's less restrictions around it, right? You can have different unchecked powers going across the galaxy. So I think in general you can mess around with it more the further you go back when there's less knowledge about force powers, when there's less conviction around factions or hatred or love around other factions, right? There's less definition of what it is. It's genuinely just a superpower back then when people just discover it, right? So before there's organized religion around these powers, I think that's an interesting place where you can explore the bridge between light and dark, and they do that admirably in Dawn of the Jedi with the Jedi Order. But even then, it starts to fracture and crumble as they some users are more light side attuned, some are more dark side attuned, and ultimately leads to the wars. And so I think most of Star Wars history would show that every time people do try to bridge those gaps, ultimately the Force pulls people to one direction or the other. And as for your next comment, Anthony, you're not asking too many questions. We love your questions. It drives the show. We really appreciate you joining us every week, and we appreciate you sending in your comments. And even if we disagree on something like this, we're happy to have this conversation and happy to have you here. So continue commenting on all the videos, continue coming to the chat and sending your questions and your comments in. We love that. We love talking with you about Star Wars. So keep sending it in, and we appreciate you joining us here, Anthony, and appreciate you always helping us start some interesting conversations for sure. Anthony also says, I remember Aftermath Empire's End when Palpatine was predicted 4 years before Episode 9. When Yuptashu said Palpatine lives on, we find him again out there in the dark. All things move to the great design. Yes, and I think prediction is a good word because I don't think it was planned. It definitely wasn't planned, but it did. It was a line that left it open for that possibility, and I think that's something, especially with what they do with Yuptashu, and even and this is also a credit to Legends, piggybacking off of Legends. Like in the Bantam era, they really played with all of Palpatine's dignitaries and friends and advisors, and there was this real cult around Palpatine and who he is and what he stood for in the dark side and the people that were in his kind of bubble. So Yuptashu being part of that, they really mess around with the idea of the occult around Palpatine, and I appreciate what they did with that. It even if Palpatine were to never return, it makes sense for some type of fanatical group like that to be obsessed with trying to figure out how to resurrect who pretty much was the one who brought all of the dark designs of the Sith forward for the first time in 1,000 years.
Yeah, and I think it's also very like representative of how early canon had a lot of stuff that eventually became concrete building blocks of the last 5 years, but like different and altered and all that. So I agree with Liam. I don't think they necessarily were like episode 9, we're gonna have Palpatine. They might have had some inkling of like he's gonna show up at some point again. We don't know if it means in the mainline films, if it's in a video game, TV show, or whatnot. But yeah, they had ideas for it, and Yuptashu is also pretty interesting because Gallius Rex kind of shoves him down and kills him in the observatory of Jakku before it's supposed to go off before Rey slow and stops Gallius. But Yuptashu is also described as being killed by Kiza in Shadow of the Sith, and Adam Christopher's like, "Yeah, I'll explain that, but not yet." So I would love to see if we get some explanation of something like that, but, it's a good question. I would say that, you know, Palpatine's return being predicted, it was just inevitable to me. I was always expecting it because EU, Dark Empire, it's still such an influential piece of storytelling. It was just never the best, and it was also very contentious because it was coming out at, like, exact same time as the Thrawn trilogy with Zahn, and Zahn and Veidt did not like each other, so I am very curious to see how they're gonna bridge the acolytes of the beyond and see how that's gonna maybe have an influence on the Sith Eternal. I'm very curious to see if Jakku will be more like it is in the Force Awakens, where it's like, nobody cares, it's just a junkyard, like a final battleground, versus Aftermath being like it's almost like a super weapon in and of itself that has like some strange occult powers and all. It'll be very interesting to see what they do here. Prediction is a nice word, but I don't know if I would say prediction, more of like a, let's throw out something that has a high likelihood of things happening. I won't probably be the one to handle it. I don't think Wending was like, "Oh, yes, I'll be writing the story," but he's probably like, let's see what Palpatine's aura, what he's doing in the direct actions, sure, but what about the people who are affected by him, his dark side influence, his closest advisors? When they also try to do some crazy things in the name of the emperor, right? Like, there's some very cool things about Aftermath. It's just not well written in a lot of ways. So I'm very curious to see how they're gonna bridge what has almost become a cornerstone with the sequels, what has become the current piece of the Mandoverse and Night Sisters kind of being involved and all these different Shadow Council factions, and then what we've got here coming back again in the comics. So, yeah, great question.
Definitely. And now to Colton, who says, I need a new animated Star Wars show like The Dark Times, as Liam has outlined. Animation should be going always in my ideal world. Well, I kind of want to bring up something else too that was just like talked about briefly with some of this other Comic-Con stuff that has come out too. I mean, maybe a little news story that piggybacks off of this as well is that people are still saying that Tales of the Jedi season 2 is coming out this fall, which is a surprise because we kind of, or at least I personally, really felt like Tales of the Empire was Tales of the Jedi season 2, but it was apparently not. So yeah, there's still rumors that that's coming out. It was a part of a report with, you know, the Skeleton Crew stuff that they've talked about at Comic-Con, and so maybe that's the next animated thing coming from Star Wars. Now that Skeleton Crew, I guess just to talk about that story as well, it seems to be almost confirmed now for Christmas time. They're saying late year. So we'll see when that is. I really hope it's not Book of Boba Fett style to where it's like literally the week after Christmas and it's just the final week of the year and it's mostly a 2025 show. I think that would suck. You know, I'm excited for it, but it would suck to wait 6 whole months for the next Star Wars show. That would be one of the longest gaps we've had in this Disney Plus era. So I don't really want that, but hey, if they need the time to work on it, give us the best product possible. But yeah, it seems like that's coming out later this year. And there's a rumor that Tales of the Jedi Season 2 is coming out sometime between now and then. So we'll see if that actually comes true. I think D23 would be the time when that would be announced, when a trailer would probably drop. I don't know what panels they're having for D23. I'm not going this year, but I would assume they'd have some type of Disney Plus panel. So if they have a Disney Plus panel or they have a live action Star Wars or Disney Studios panel, we'll see if they give us that announcement about Tales of the Jedi. But Skeleton Crew is now looking like even later than I kind of hoped. I was hoping for that like October, November release, but it's looking even later. This is all, you know, coming from an interview with Lee Isaac Chung. So, but you know, it also reminded me how great the director list is for Skeleton Crew. Like it's unreal, the director list for Skeleton Crew. Like for those of you who don't know, Lee Isaac Chung, the Daniels, who are now Oscar winners from Everything Everywhere All at Once, are directing an episode. John Watts from the Spider-Man Homecoming trilogy, David Lowery, who's had some misses recently, but Ghost Story is a very weird, interesting film. You guys should check it out. Bryce Dallas Howard, and even Jake Schreier is the last one, and he's done some really interesting independent films too. So, but he's more of a TV person, so it's nice to have some TV people on there because sometimes you get bogged down with film people and the show doesn't flow as well as it maybe should. But it's got an insane list of directors. Like this is by far the highest talent, or at least most
Yeah.
notable group of directors we've seen for a Star Wars live action TV show ever. So, just kind of side note, but that it's crazy how talented the people behind Skeleton Crew are. It's making me so excited for the show. I hope it's great. But yeah, maybe next Star Wars show. I think we heard we didn't talk about it this week, but last week or so, it's a little old news now at this point, but there was the rumor that they're hiring now at Lucasfilm for animators for the next Star Wars show. Doesn't mean if you know if they're just starting on it now, we're not going to get the announcement for that until at the earliest next year, maybe the year after. We've talked about the rumors of an anime coming for a while. I think they're always going to perpetually have some type of show using the Clone Wars animation style. That's kind of where my Dark Times theory came from, is they're going to have some type of show that uses that animation. They've invested too much money into it. They perfected it too well to not utilize that animation style. It's sitting there for them to use whenever they want. They're going to always have something. But I agree with you, Colton. They need to have animation going. Animation really should kind of replace these gaps between live action. Like I'm okay if we get 2 seasons of live action TV a year, and then there's animation for the most part all throughout those gaps. Like animation is something that really is part of the fabric of Star Wars, like the EU between the 90s and the Phantom Menace. Animation kept Star Wars alive for so many years until The Force Awakens, between Revenge of the Sith and The Force Awakens. So definitely want to see a new animated show announced soon, and hopefully it gets announced at D23 or something, but it's probably going to be next year.
Yeah, no, and I think I read that same interview from Lee Isaac Chung. I'm a big fan of his work. I think Twisters just came out, and that's been getting some great reviews. Minari is a very underrated film. I actually love David Lowery's Green Knight. I'm a very big fan of
Yes.
that. So there's also a rumor that this show is gonna one that's gonna be the most alien heavy and like most lived in like areas for these characters, these kids to follow. And we've also seen someone like go thrifting and find like a crew promo poster that looks like one of those metal ingots, right? Just
Mhm.
colorized now. So, unfortunately, that has also meant that some trolls and chuds online are like, "Oh, why? Where's the white guy? Where's this?" And that's like Jude Law is the lead, guys. It's not like they just didn't hire an incredible actor to be the adult lead for this show. It's like we don't know anything, right? And seeing a promo poster and judging these kids who are one of them is an Ortolan, which is awesome, a Max Rebo-like character. But kids, they don't deserve some of the toxicity that this fandom has been going through. I'm so worried about them. I wonder if the delay is just to almost like give them preparation time to be like, all right, like let's get you aged up a little bit and get ready for the inevitability of it. But that's the one thing animation doesn't have. I've never really seen immense hatred. Like, I think there was for Ahsoka for a good while,
Yeah.
until season 3, but it wasn't. It's not something people think or talk about on the daily like we do with live action TV shows, and especially with the movies. So it was annoying, and I think it was fair to criticize Ahsoka 'cause, there's only so many times you can hear snips and Sky Guy and quips for, like, 2 seasons, but once she matures, look at her now. Like, the criticism for her is that she's lived too long, right? Not that she's a bad character. Everyone loves her character, it's just like, okay. And arguably, people are like, "Go back to animation, man. She's better there than she ever was in live action." So
Yeah.
yeah, I love animation. I like that Liam's idea quite a bit of having a big final, like, staging ground for all these stories to, you know, build up and flesh a good staging ground for, like, almost like a Solo 2 or a little Lando movie to really, like, kickstart some ideas and pieces, like, do a little bit more of the Crimson Dawn stuff and why Maul is stuck on Malachor. Like, there's so many things that you can do that you don't have to do in comics or books, but maybe you just wanna do in a couple arcs, right? So I would love that for animation. Our last 2 animated shows have been kind of low key outside of Tales, right? Resistance, it's something. It's not like a huge piece of what you need to know for the sequel trilogy. At best, it's like a nice auxiliary piece for Resistance Reborn, but there isn't really much about Resistance Reborn that is essential either to Episode 9, the same way that Shadow the Sith feels a lot more essential, right? So yeah, I mean, I love an anime, like Liam was saying. I wanna see what comes out of that. I feel like Celebration 2025 in Japan, they're gonna be like, "Yeah, no, like, we're announcing something there." But if they are gonna use this animation style that they've mastered, I almost kinda just want them to, like, just only push it up to where Rebels is in the timeline. Like, the only other usage past that has been that New Republic era episode with Morgan Elsbeth. Otherwise, everything has been Dark Times, everything has been Clone Wars. It's nice, but yeah, I mean, I miss an impactful show that can touch on everything. That's what Bad Batch kinda started off as, and then it was like, "Let's focus on our characters." Maybe the success of season 2 was a little less than expected. They also didn't market it well, so I
Yeah.
really feel like they pulled back things for season 3, and it was still good. I still like a lot of what they did, with Mount Tantus. It can definitely be used in Thrawn's next appearance if they wanna really throw it back to the original Thrawn trilogy. But yeah, it's animation needs to get elevated a little bit more again. It's nice for the fandom. It's always where some of the most interesting lore and character development happens because of the length of the format. You don't have restrictions, right? It's really just your animation budget. And yeah, I mean, I'd love for them to, if they not don't do Dark Times, just finally flesh out things like Luke Skywalker's Academy. That's one that's ripe to be a big, big, important show again, and then also be like a sequel era thing, right? Or maybe just start off stuff after the Rise of Skywalker. Now that they've seen how early canon was trying to flesh out the beginnings of that 30-year gap versus Mandoverse kind of taking over, maybe there are lessons learned there where you can start off with animation and then build out your live action. Who knows? But yeah, no, I love animation for Star Wars. It's been the healthiest part of the fandom since the inception, right? The only time you could say that people are down on Star Wars animation for like serious reasons was just that people were upset that there weren't movies after Return of the Jedi and we had droids and Ewoks. Right? It's like, okay, I don't know if I want the Ewoks universe dominating the rest of Star Wars, but even then, right? I feel like people still have nostalgia and happiness for it. Live action shows and movies, it's a lot more up and down.
Absolutely. Yeah, and animated movies should be a possibility too. Like we've had an animated Marvel movie with Big Hero 6, like we
Yeah.
could have an animated Star Wars movie. There's no reason why having the two biggest animation studios in the world, you can't make an animated Star Wars movie as well. And so, yeah, that should be a possibility, especially if we're looking at Disney Plus films or an animated theatrical release would be awesome. I think there's a lot of directions they can go with animation. It's just a matter of how seriously do they want to stick to the medium. And I do think an anime Star Wars movie is a higher likelihood than a full-fledged show. But, anime is the biggest thing in the world right now. Like it is the biggest form of long form entertainment right now. And it's international, right? So if you're trying to capture a bigger international audience for Star Wars, and especially in some of the Asian countries where it's not as big, because Star Wars is big in Japan, but it's not necessarily as big in China or some of these other places around that do have a larger anime following. So if you're trying to capture some of these other markets, Star Wars hasn't been particularly as big in non-European and American markets. So we'll see. Hopefully, something like that could actually branch them out. And I think animation is a good place to do it. Animation seems to be more universal than live action film right now. So be awesome to see them try to capitalize on that. So we're going to go for about 15, 20, 30, maybe more minutes, depending on the conversation, everybody. So send in your last questions, your last comments, your thoughts, your theories, anything you would like to discuss, maybe a story that was a more minor story that we haven't talked about. There's a lot of fallout from the Acolyte, conversations with actors and directors and Leslie Headland and all sorts of things. So if you guys have anything you want to specifically talk about for the next 20 minutes or so, let us know that in the comments or send in your last comments about anything you want. It doesn't have to be Star Wars related. So send it in. Colton says, just finished the Kenobi book by John Jackson Miller. Easily one of the best Star Wars books of all time. Makes me think what could have been with the Obi-Wan show. Hey, I'm with you, Colton. The more and more we get away from the Obi-Wan show, the more and more it's disappointing. Not necessarily that they didn't follow the book, but that they didn't just stick closer to that time period. I don't understand why 10 years was the decision other than to have Luke and Leia in it. That's really the only reason. There's nothing else. I think like you could add Inquisitors still in it and set it after Revenge of the Sith. You could add Bail Organa still in it and set it after Revenge of the Sith. You could add pretty much the same exact story with Vader and set it after Revenge of the Sith. But they didn't because they wanted Luke and Leia in it. And so that's the main reason. But it is a great show. And I'm hoping for a season 2 of Obi-Wan that sticks a little closer to the book. I mean, a great book. And I'm hoping for a season 2 that sticks closer to the book because I think that's the way to go. I want to see more Obi-Wan because I want to see more Ewan McGregor. But the thing is, I don't necessarily want to see him doing anything big and galaxy defining anymore. Like I wouldn't mind a prequel story to the Obi-Wan season 1 where you have an Obi-Wan season 2 that goes back in time and tells this exact story right after Revenge of the Sith, really touches on a lot of the things that do break Obi-Wan. Or follow up and do a training show with Qui-Gon. Because in the book, as you know, he can't communicate with Qui-Gon yet. He's trying, but he can't communicate with Qui-Gon. So uh, yeah, I think going back in time and telling that story, and then maybe for a season 3, if season 2 is popular and you stick to that Western element, maybe you can go with another Western story, a more modern Western story, something similar to what we've seen in the comics from Jason Aaron, where you can touch on Obi-Wan's adventures on Tatooine, protecting Luke, and all those different things. So I would like to see that. I think there's plenty more room for Obi-Wan stories. There's just not room for Obi-Wan to be traversing the galaxy and fighting big epic battles with Darth Vader anymore. Like we've already towed that line. I don't think we should tow it anymore. Just move on from it and let Obi-Wan be Obi-Wan. Let the show be about Obi-Wan, and that's what I hope we get for a possible season 2 or 3. But the book is excellent, and it is one of the seminal stories about that character in all of Star Wars, both Legends and canon.
Yeah, I think it's a very underrated book. Unfortunately, just like one of those things that people haven't read because it came out fairly late into EU. Uh, to me, with the nature of Obi-Wan Kenobi, I would almost like just want a special edition to just like boost up some of the effects, some of the landscape shots, make Jump
Yeah,
In look a little bit better before they actually do anything else. Like I think that if there's a show that you could be like, here's a special edition, you guys will actually appreciate it. It is Obi-Wan Kenobi because yeah, I mean, it's not great in its, character design, right? Grand Inquisitor does not look great. Fifth Brother is passable at best. And that's what is gonna be, like, the defining image for a lot of people for these characters, even though their animated versions are better. I think Fifth Brother is a little bit more up in the I think at least he has something to do in Kenobi as a character versus Rebels, he's just a dumb brute, but that dumb brute is more intimidating because he is big, he is huge, but yeah, I mean, I know they wanted Luke and Leia, that's a fact. I know they wanted Ben Solo naming to, like, really make sense here, right? It is almost like the inverse of Legends Leia going for Anakin Solo as opposed to
yeah,
Ben Solo, right? And I like it. I actually do like that she would consider Obi-Wan over her murderous father who tortured her, right? Like, I think that makes a little bit more sense to me than how fairly easily, like, Tatooine Ghost, like, just makes it like, "Oh, yeah, she's fine. She understands. She doesn't have to love Anakin, but she can almost, like, redeem him with her son." But I that also puts pressure on her son. I never really loved that decision. But when we look at Obi-Wan's story, I don't know, I'd almost wanna skip a season 2 and just do, like, a special presentation of Obi-Wan. Just focus on his Force training, do it over, like, an hour plus, something like that. And then you could do an even short miniseries, do like 3, 4 episodes just on his training. Um, I'm just a little nervous about flashbacks these days with live action shows. I just don't think how these shows are constructed, especially since they're like 4 to 6 hour movies as opposed to TV shows, that jumping back and forth, it doesn't really work. I mean, if you do something where in his training, he is going back to those initial traumatic days after Revenge of the Sith, after he cut down his apprentice, after all the Jedi are killed, and then you bring in these Kenobi elements and the story from that, that's fine. But I almost want like it to be visually defined. Like these are like memories that he's almost walking through that he has to overcome before he can really progress in his training. Like these are just some of these roadblocks that he has, and then in between those off periods of his training, he is doing some more of like the comics esque uh, Obi-Wan, where he's randomly showing up, making crate dragon noises, like just a wandering old hermit, right? And there's a way to do that. But is it really something I think a full season would like really hinge on? No. Plus, if you're gonna do it for a full season, it's gotta be both fairly low budget and be really good for what it's done, like production value wise. And I don't trust the Disney Plus shows as they are right now to like really handle that outside of Andor. Like it's to do Kenobi well, like the book well, you need someone with like a really deft touch. It can't just be like, oh, like fun gimmicks. It is a very much a character study. And as you know, Kenobi isn't really about Kenobi. It's about the people who are seeing Kenobi, right? And if you're gonna bring back Ewan, I really doubt they do that, where he'd just be like in 5, 10 minutes of each episode. So to invert that and still be as good as like the tone and everything that John Jackson Miller perfected in that book, that's hard. I really do think you need to have a good investment, a good director, good value for your production, and only like 3 or 4 episodes to really pull it off, it'll be tough, but whatever happens, Ewan is gonna force something. The way he's been talking about Kenobi, he's like, "I wanna be back. I wanna do stuff," and I don't think even tossing him a bone to be like a Force ghost post Return of the Jedi is gonna be enough for him at this point, so I'm gonna be happy to see whatever comes, but it's almost like it can't be bigger than the Kenobi show. That's the strange dilemma that it's in right
right.
now, so what we'll see is what we'll see.
Yeah, I think the biggest they could possibly get, and I still don't really want to see this, but the biggest they could get is to make him actively involved with the path, the hidden path,
Yeah.
and bring in other Jedi and bring in all these other things. But then I think you run the risk of getting scarily close to what the plot of Obi-Wan season 1 was, which is
Yeah.
a show that is hampered by 50 different plot points. Like I think the nice thing about an Obi-Wan, the future of Obi-Wan would be to try to keep it simple. It's the thing that's great about the Kenobi book is it's a true Western, and it's very simple, a simple character study. And I think the only thing that doesn't work about going back in time at this point, I would really like to see that. Like I would really like them to go back to 18 BBY and tell that Obi-Wan story, or 19 BBY and tell that Obi-Wan story. But he has a revelation at the end of the book, kind of spoilers for people who haven't read it, but he has a revelation, kind of a similar revelation that he has at the end of season 1 of Obi-Wan, right? So he can't really have that revelation. I think the one thing you can maybe do is make him at peace a bit with Anakin's supposed death. I think that's maybe what you can do. But he's still shouldering the weight of what happened in Revenge of the Sith, and he's still shouldering the weight of what happened to the Jedi Order in Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's shouldering the weight of both of those things. So it's difficult to tell a story before that where he has some type of revelation about himself or about his future, and very obviously difficult to tell a story about him basically turning into old Ben because he has all those revelations in the Obi-Wan show. It's just not the same way as the Western. So I feel like you would have to set it after, but it would lose a bit of the revelation part. So it's a tricky story, but I would really like to see the Western elements, not just for the fact that Mosip Banid is a big character in the Kenobi book, but I think, exploring the Tatooine underworld, all that type of stuff is very cool. It's something they could really do a good job with. And I would hope they could do a good job with. And I think it's a story that's ripe for telling. The original idea for the Obi-Wan show before it was a show was a movie, and it was Western oriented, with both sets of directors and both writers that were on. So I'd love to see it one day. We'll see if that ever actually happens. Jar Jarby Binko says, "Hi lads, hope you're having a great summer." We are. I can't speak for you, Cynic, but I am having a good summer so far.
It's hot. I'll say that for sure.
Yes. Oh God.
Currently feeling a little swamped in my room, but yeah, no, I'm enjoying it. I think Star Wars year round kind of keeps everything at a nice level.
Yeah, it's been miserably hot this summer, but overall, pretty good summer. K-pop Time says, "Hey y'all, hi K-pop Times." Colton says, "Aftermath trilogy very underrated in my opinion. Really enjoyed it, although it starts slow. Would love another ambitious canon trilogy." I agree that it's underrated. Colton is still not one of my favorites. Trying to think of all the trilogies in canon, it might. I haven't finished the Queen's trilogy, but out of the big three, if we're not including like High Republic trilogies, or the subsets of books in High Republic, the big, or I guess there's the big four trilogies are Canon, Thrawn, Disconnected trilogy, Thrawn Ascendancy, Alphabet Squadron, and Aftermath. Um, and Aftermath might be my least favorite of those four, but it is still underrated because it gets so much better by the time you get to Empire's End. It is a really solid conclusion. I do think it's a really solid conclusion. The first book is just still one of the worst books in canon, and so I think it has a hard time getting people on board because it's very dull, slow start, like you said. But it is, and I think Windick's writing style is certainly something you have to get used to. But it does end on a fairly high note. So, and an ambitious canon trilogy is, I think, what we need to reignite Star Wars publishing. Right now, High Republic's starting to come to a close. What's next for the publishing, right? We're already starting to see a fizzle out with High Republic as well. Like, it just does not seem like the interest is there as it was in 2021. 2021, obviously, an optimal year to start a book initiative because people are home with time to read. But it does not seem like, and I personally kind of attribute this to High Republic Phase Two. I don't have any numbers to actually back that up, or any actual proof from Del Rey or from Disney or Lucasfilm, but it seems like people fell off after High Republic Phase 2, having to start basically a completely new story with completely new characters. and having to wait almost 2 years to find out what happened to the characters that were in the first phase. I think if phase one would have ended in January of 21 or 22, and then phase two was actually a continuation of that story and it didn't start till the end of the year or maybe the next January, I think people would have stayed on board. But I think people fell off. And then now there's a confusion on, do I need to read phase two? What did I need to jump back into phase three? How many books am I now behind? I think that's the nature of a publishing initiative. You kind of fall apart with all that. So maybe an ambitious canon trilogy in the New Republic would be awesome. I still think they're not willing to touch that right now because they want to solidify what they're doing on TV and film with the New Republic era. It is the thing that's driving Star Wars right now. And so unless they figure that out, we're not going to see a book trilogy there. I hope to see one maybe with the big three, but we'll see. But yeah, I think ambitious Star Wars book trilogy is something that we need with characters that we know and love to really perpetuate Star Wars publishing back into like the glory days we had pre-canon.
Yeah, I mean, Aftermath, Life Debt, I think is actually my favorite of the 3. I know people say Empire's End. I just found that Empire's End was a little tedious about some of its stuff. It had incredible highs, like with Battle of Jakku, Gallius Rex and Ray Sloan really coming to face, Nora Wexley, Snap, everyone are really evolving, right? Centaur Velis is very underrated as a character for me. It's just that we haven't heard anything from them. We haven't seen anything. Like that is the beauty of us going into this Battle Jakku maxi series that we might be able to get some like brushes with these characters to remind us, to refresh us, so that they can show up in Mandoverse, so that they can just be good background characters or supporting characters, or they can show up in new books and stuff. Empire's End, Life Debt, I think those are both good books. It's just Aftermath with that cover of the Death Star too, right? I'd say like that trilogy has probably the most iconic looking covers. All right, it's just that it's not really an iconic story until the last book, right? Even Life Debt, as much as I like it. It's because we spent a lot of time with Han on Kashyyyk and the Liberation, which is a very EU concept. It happens there anyhow, right? So yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Colton. It's underrated as a whole. I just wish it was written in a different prose. I don't like Chuck Wendig's prose at all. The wibbling and wobbling of the TIE fighters, I'll never get that out of my head. That's just it sucks. But yeah, maybe this maxi series gets Ray Sloan and the Imperial Future Council and all these characters really fleshed out. Maybe some of the characters that are on this council are the characters that we see survive into Moff Gideon's Shadow Council of Mando season 3. Like, I'd love for them to be built out, fleshed out, connected properly. We'll see. I think that's why it's so nice to have these comics right now, is because one, we get to put a face to characters like Gallius
Mm-hmm.
and Moff Rad and all these other characters that are pretty important in the first Aftermath book and all. But also, like, we get to do a little bit more of a low stakes testing of like, okay, do people have interest in these characters that we didn't really care for in the last like 7 to 8 years? Like, will they have that same appreciation? And I think people will, because of how they're pushing that maxi series to be biweekly. I agree with Liam. Like, High Republic going to phase two, 150 years before phase one, right? I get Star Wars likes doing in media res. Like, it's nice to start in the middle, go back, and then go in the future. Sure, but the future of phase 1 of phase 3 is a year or 2, right?
Yeah.
The past of phase 2 is the past. It's 150 years, right? It's not even like prequel trilogy where it's like, oh, 20 years or something, and people think that's too short considering how old Vader and Obi-Wan look, right? This is just like, what real connection can you make? And, to their credit, they have brought some characters in comics, in the books. It's interesting what they're doing, but the nature of denial is that they are forgotten, that they are just an edge of the galaxy conflict that stops the Republic from being this expansionary, very helpful entity throughout the galaxy. It becomes a little bit more centralized as time goes on by the Acolyte, by the prequel. So I think now we're really kind of facing that of like, what is Mark Rowe really gonna do here at the end? Is he gonna do something incredible, or is it gonna be something that is kind of cut short just as he's like about to achieve a new stunning level of like success, right? And look, I still think what they're doing in Phase 3 is quite good. It's just it's also very spaced out, and a lot of things in Phase 2 were spaced out, but with less content, so it was easy to drop off, and the world had opened up. It's just a simple
Right.
fact. So I know there's rumors of getting a Phase 4 and stuff connecting to Acolyte, and I want that stuff. I just don't want it to be a Phase 4. I'd just like to have books deal with characters who can live up to that. Burnett, like a Buryaga, whoever can survive, and then maybe some new characters that are bridge Jedi or bridge politicians that really
Mhm.
put us in place of the Acolyte. But I wouldn't want that to be still the big books initiative, really. I'd want, like Liam is saying, characters that we don't have the live action actors for anymore, like Carrie Fisher and all that. We want to bring back their roles to the forefront and set up things so that they have story that's taking place concurrently with the Mandiverse before their recast, before their deepfakes or whatever happens there. You know, books are good with Thrawn and all that, but they're not they're not the big EU hitting characters that were like the defining parts of keeping Star Wars alive for so long. We're gonna get back to that. I don't think we're not. I think people are too positive on Shadow of the Sith to be like, oh, like Lucasfilm to be like, and Luke Del Rey to be like, oh, maybe there is an interest. There is a lot of interest. People still talk about Shadow of the Sith because of how underrated it is, and that book is so sparse. Stuff. People even talk about Rise of Kylo Ren, a 4-issue miniseries, because they're like, oh my god, there's so much that we saw about Kylo, even if it is fairly spaced out and rushed instead of in depth and rich as we want. But now we want to know who the hell Ben Solo was if we're going to see the fall like this. We're going to get these bigger characters getting books again. I just do think it's really dependent on just how strong they finish High Republic Phase 3. If they ended on a little bit of whimper, they go straight into those books. And
Right.
these maxi series for Battle of Jakku only gives them further reason to. If they end on a really strong note with Phase 3 and everyone's like, I need more and more and more, we might be pushing that out a few more years.
No, definitely. And I agree about High Republic. Like, we don't need phase 4 or phase 5. Just tell bridging stories. I want to see stories that bridge phase 2 and phase 1. I want to see stories that bridge phase 3 and the Acolyte. Right now, I think the time period is well known enough that you don't have to set a whole publishing initiative around it anymore. You can put out individualized stories like we used to get for the Old Republic or New Republic era or prequel era in different time periods across what was prominent in Star Wars publishing and Star Wars storytelling. So hopefully we get to see that here soon. But as for your next question, Colton, is there one Star Wars book or book trilogy that you would like to see made into a movie or show? I've been thinking about that. I mean, I'm gonna say the same ones I always say. This one a bit more tentatively than usual for me personally, because you guys know my thoughts on the Acolyte. But Darth Plagueis is still my favorite Star Wars book of all time. I still want to see a movie of it or a show. Not connected to the Acolyte in any way personally, but I want to see that. I love Palpatine's origin story even more so than anything related to Darth Plagueis. I want to see the Palpatine origin story done. I want to see his rise. He's such an important character now, especially with his lineage being kind of the one that's left and living on as a joint Palpatine Skywalker here in the future. Palpatine's more important to Star Wars than he's ever been. I would like to see Palpatine's origin story done. And the other one I think would make an excellent trilogy of films or a great high budget, I repeat that, high budget, very serious 50, 40-minute, 45-minute, 50-minute episode, hour-long episode style show would be Bane. The Bane trilogy would be perfect for television. You could flesh out so many things that happen in between the books as well. There's so much rich storytelling at the end of the fall of the Sith Empire and the rise of what became the Republic. I want to see that as well. And with canon's tendency to work backwards, it seems like the next step, if you don't do anything between High Republic and what would be the Old Republic, is to tell that fall of the Old Republic story. I've said it many times on here. I personally wouldn't do that. I would go back and tell the entirety of the Old Republic era, starting from the beginning of it all the way to the end, shrinking the timeline and the gap a little bit between what happens in something like Tales of the Jedi to eventually Bane. I still think there should be large gaps between different eras and different stories within the Old Republic era. Like obviously, one of the things that makes it so special are the wars and the constant fighting and the rise and fall in power across different factions. But I don't think it needs to be 3,000 years long. I think it should be something that's maybe 1,000 years long, or 1,500 at the most, and shrunk down. Especially have characters really build off of and flow into each other. Their impact and importance are there. Like, Revan's one of the massive impacts on Bane's philosophy. Well, you know, that Revan's like an ancient Sith by the time of Bane, even though it's the same era. You could have them a little closer together, maybe separated by 500-600 years, to where Revan's philosophy is still out there in the galaxy. There's so many different things you can do, and maybe you could set that up originally in a Bane series. But those would be my two. I personally, those are like two of my top three favorite Star Wars stories, and we're already getting a version of Thrawn. So those would be those would be the ones. Another offbeat one, though, just because those are so common. Republic Commando. I think Republic Commando can make a really interesting live action TV series. I think it would be fun to have different seasons about different missions with the commandos. You could bring over some of that philosophy we see from animation. We obviously know that the Clone Wars era is something that's incredibly rich and people really love. Why not try it with live action? We've already gotten our first dip into the waters of Jedi kind of prequel adjacent stories with the Acolyte, but why not go to an era that people already love? People have been clamoring for a Clone Wars live action series now that you had Hayden and Ahsoka in live action in that flashback in the world between worlds. Why not have some type of Clone Wars show that maybe brings in other cameos or brings in other battles that you could connect different parts of, tells a different side of the Star Wars Clone Wars story from the Commandos perspective. And the Commandos were so important in the Bad Batch, but we basically never see them in the Clone Wars animated show outside of Gregor. So what were they doing? What was happening with all that? Maybe try to tie in some of the philosophy of the Mandalorians and stuff that you see so prominently in Travis's work, and the way now post Clone Wars 3D animated show, Django has been recanonized to be an actual Mandalorian. Maybe bring back some of that stuff. I think that would be interesting. That would be my outside of the box thought for a possible show.
Yeah, man, I wanna say that everything that I wanted to see from books and EU and comics is kinda happening, right? Like, we're gonna get the Thrawn trilogy of some sorts adapted. Uh, I guess Dawn of the Jedi too, I think it's gonna be very different. I really doubt it's gonna be like Jedi and all those things, because frankly, it's just a book and a comic series with 3 runs. It's not anything to be like, "Oh my god, like, it's erased, I'm gonna hate it forever." It's like, there's not enough. You could still incorporate that and make that almost later, right? 'Cause, the funniest thing about the Dawn of the Jedi stuff is that it's not the dawn. Things have already happened. Right now, you're
Right.
just dealing with it, right? So, yeah, Dawn of the Jedi could still be even earlier than that when it is really a superpower. It is something that is discovered with the Force, right? So, yeah, I mean, I'm very curious to see if they can maybe do like a TV show continuing off of Dawn of the Jedi. I think it's a great way to kinda go back, but not, like, deal with, like you're saying, the massive implications of the Old Republic. The Old Republic deserves an HBO level production. It just does. It's just a fact. I think as much as I love High Republic, it isn't as insane or intense at every moment. It's not as dark or even grim dark as a lot of Old Republic is, and, I find some elements of it unnecessary in the books for especially the Old Republic, Star Wars: The Old Republic tie-ins. I'm like, "Alright, we're just pushing it to just full on edginess." That's not really the Star Wars I personally love. But, yeah, no, I mean, the timeline needs to be shrunk. We know Bane gets defeated at the end. How he's gonna be defeated is gonna be very true, 'cause it seems like the Republic's a lot more aware of it, especially with what Canon has said, and it's strictly 1000 BBY, right? So it's like there are a lot of things I wanna see of those stories. If there was something that you could, like, almost do as a movie and have fun while you're still doing these long running, like, HBO quality shows, maybe like a Knight Errant. I think that'd be pretty interesting as, like, almost like a bridge to really focus more on, like, the very closing stages, the aftermath of New Sith Wars and why Bane is than like a character to be picked up in the following season, right? It'd be nice if like between like season 4 of after we just finished off KOTOR 3 or Star Wars: The Old Republic or whatever, they amalgamate and make new out of that. They're like, okay, let's put in a movie here that we can put in theaters, right? And this is just like, okay, how are the Jedi? How are the Sith surviving? Are there cults of like famous Sith and Jedi that are around? Are they more feudalistic? All this and that, right? Knight Errant does a fairly good job. It is a little bit of a boring book in my mind. But then once you watch that, then you'll be prepared for Bane and why everything's so desolate, why everything is so low tech and suddenly changed. Like Star Wars fans don't get, but war usually destroys a lot of things. And I think the Old Republic emphasizes that war should really destroy civilizations and the galaxy. But we don't really see that in the Skywalker saga. We don't really see that in animation and all that. So this would be a great chance to connect, kind of almost do like a Mando season 1 into the Rise of Skywalker, where similar power between Grogu and Rey, right? Just do something like that, but have it be important story wise. Just be like, well, you can see it, you don't have to, but it gives you, like, a good idea of, like, this why the scope has dramatically changed by the time of Bane, it's become more character focused. So I'd love something like that. Like I said, continuation of Dawn of the Jedi movie into what we had with the Dawn of the Jedi of the EU. Outside of that, maybe Rogue Squadron as a TV show, I think I like those X-Wing books. I'm almost done with Wedge's Gamble. We're definitely gonna do a Legends book club on Rogue Squadron, the first book in that series, pretty soon here. But yeah, no, I mean, I get the appeal of, like, making movies, like, with Patty Jenkins and all that, but Top Gun: Maverick already came out, and it already basically did that and combined it with the trench run of A New Hope. If you're gonna do character-focused stuff like the X-Wing books and all that, I think they're better suited for a show, and you can keep it, honestly, like this current level and format of a lot of the Disney Plus show. You don't have to be super in-depth with these characters. You can just build out a squadron, give them tropish qualities, and send them on unique missions, right? Like, they don't have to just be starfighter missions. They can be stuff where they're on the ground or where they're doing infiltration or there's mystery, just like how those books are. It's a great way to bring back some EU characters, and then by the time the Mandalorian and Grogu movies, sorry, the New Republic film by Filoni comes out, right? Then you can
Mhm.
just throw in these characters and be like, "Hey, like they had a season where we got used to Corin Horn and we got to see Wedge Antilles recast and stuff like that." And then it'll be like the Thrawn trilogy where the Rogue Squadron is there, but we just didn't know anything about it until they got fleshed out afterwards. So I think a TV show is fine for X-wing dogfighting and all that. You don't have to go crazy. I honestly don't think you need to be like, we need to see every single battle. So much of the X-wing books are also focused on going to Coruscant in the start too, and Coruscant in canon is surrendered by Masameda, right? And there's more internal revolutions and all that. So whatever they're gonna do is gonna be more outer rim focused. It's gonna be more of what they're doing in Mandoverse, kind of almost like Rangers of the New Republic. I'd love to see that be combined with the X-wing of old, who are basically Rangers, right? So, yeah, I'd like to see that, but movies right now, I don't know. I think it's really just Knight Errant for me.
Those are all good choices. And Colton says Shatterpoint would be too niche, but maybe would be awesome. I think it would be awesome. I almost said Shatterpoint. And I think, what Lucasfilm got from the movie was people don't want to see spin-offs anymore. I don't think that could be farther from the truth. I think people just don't want to see origin stories, especially
Yeah.
origin stories for characters that don't feature the original actor who's so iconic with the role, origin stories that are best hits really of a book trilogy that came out in the past and did it far better, origin stories that have uneven plots or uneven tone. It's just and also had zero marketing. Like I think
Yeah.
they learned the wrong lessons from Solo, and I hope they kind of figure that out as it goes. That like, there are fans of Solo. There's interest with Solo because it's an all right movie. I never thought it was great. It's an all right movie, and it does have its defenders for sure. And I think a Mace Windu movie would be awesome. People would love that. People would love an Obi-Wan movie. People would love an Anakin movie. People would love a Captain Rex movie. All these movies would work. They would, maybe to varying levels of degrees. Like, I think when Solo came out, Star Wars was 3 for 3 with billion-dollar movies. Rogue One so far exceeded their expectations. They just thought they were untouchable. And then Solo was a little bit of a gut check. I think with the lowered expectations right now around theatrical release film, lowered expectations right now around Star Wars in general, I think they would be pretty happy if they released a Captain Rex movie and it made $600 million like Solo did. Like I think the thought around the box office has changed. And I think people would love to see Sam Jackson return as Mace Windu for a Shatterpoint movie. Like that would be awesome. And I think they could kind of create their own little Clone Wars pocket universe if they really wanted to, with spinoffs. But we'll see. We'll see. But thank you guys so much for joining us for this stream. We appreciate it as always. Make sure you tune in every single week. If you're just finding this on replay, make sure you come back. We'll be trying to do this every Tuesday, like I said at the beginning, sticking to the Tuesday 7 p.m. Pacific time. But if there are some big news story that drops, we'll get back to trying to cover it the day it drops, like we usually do when there's no show going on. So stay tuned on the channel for that. And then, business as usual with the channel. You'll still be getting plenty of videos. We did just drop a Star Wars movies and TV show ranking, which is kind of our, right now seminal list for how we rank everything big in Star Wars. Make sure you check that out. And then we have more tier lists coming for you. We have a Darksiders ranking with The Stranger on there as well. And then we have more and more videos coming. I got my timeline videos coming. I've got that other video teased last week, which is almost done. That one will be coming out soon. So we have plenty more content for you guys coming throughout the rest of the summer and into possibly a 6-month dead period here between now and Skeleton Crew. So hopefully you guys are enjoying the content, and we look forward to interacting with you guys in a variety of ways. Stay tuned. More shorts and more polls still coming out all the time. And we greatly appreciate your guys' support every week. So if you are just discovering this and you're like, I didn't realize they're still streaming after the Acolyte, we're still streaming, so make sure you check it out every single week. Thank you so much for watching this week's stream, and we will see you guys all next week. Good night, everyone.